I'm Dr. Ann Peterson. You've seen me a few times over the last couple of days. I am really, really honored to be here this afternoon to introduce our next and our final speaker. And I told David Beckmann that it's only because of his stature and what I know he's going to be talking to us about that we can keep all of you here for this final session after our intense couple days. I will tell you that I have known about Bread for the World and been a supporter of Bread from the World probably from within the first 6 months I became a Christian in the middle of medical school in 1981, and started supporting Bread for the World and just have really, really admired the voice that they give to the poor and to the hungry. And as I was in various of my positions, both in the faith-based and the secular world, the secular people know Bread for the World too, as a true and honest voice for the voiceless and the hungry in the world. So it is really my honor to introduce David Beckmann. He is a World Food Prize laureate. He is a reverend, and he has been the president of Bread for the World since 1991. And it's certainly scaled up and given voice to very, very important issues, building alliances around hunger with many partners, both faith-based and others. And it's my honor to welcome David Beckmann.
Am I on? Not yet. Do I need this?
Yes.
Well, I've heard now that you're really tired, you're absolutely exhausted, you're having a hard time keeping your eyes open. So I'll do what I can. I really love CCIH. I really admire you and know that this is a group of people who are deeply committed to the health of the world, grounded in the gospel. And so it's an honor for me to be here with you. And I know that this group of people is changing the world for God. So if you learn something in this hour, if you're inspired to do something a little differently this hour, I know that this hour will have far-reaching effects on the Christian mission and on the future of the world. You're an extraordinary group of people. Let me also just introduce Bread for the World. We're a collective Christian voice urging our nation's leaders to help end hunger in our country and around the world. But we don't mean hunger in a secular way. It's not like passing out food. We mean hunger like give us this day our daily bread. So we do a lot of work to get the U.S. Congress, the U.S. President to support funding for health sector programs. It's an important part of what our government does on global poverty generally. And we also work on issues that affect people at the bottom of the economic pyramid here in the United States. In fact, I don't think we can get our country to provide the kind of leadership that we should be providing for the health of the world until we can get our country to get serious about economic deprivation in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities across this country. And so Bread for the World organizes in all stripes of churches. We have strong relationships with the Catholic bishops and the leadership of about 50 Protestant bodies and agencies of all stripes, evangelical, black churches, Latino, mainline, because whatever else we disagree on among the churches, it's just clear that God wants what's good for people who are suffering from deprivation. And we try to make it clear that it's important for us to change laws and structures in a way that will help and provide opportunity to people in need in this country and also all over the world. and do that on a very large scale. Now, I'm going to talk first about the biblical basis for advocacy on public policy. Then I'm going to talk about practical reasons for advocacy on public policy. Then I'm going to talk about the gospel grounding of advocacy on public, you get the drift? And then I want to talk about why advocacy on public policy issues is really urgent right now. Just to give me a sense, how many of you will be involved in the CCIH Advocacy Day tomorrow? That's great. That's great. And how many of you are involved in advocacy, if you're Americans, with the US Congress, or if you're from another country with officials of your own government? How many of you are involved in advocacy on an ongoing basis? Great. And then I'm curious, how many of you are already connected to Bread for the World's network? Great, great. Okay. So first, the biblical basis of advocacy. I think I've never met a Christian who didn't understand the connection between Jesus and people in need. It's just hard to miss that. But most Christians do not understand that they have a responsibility to help change laws and structures. That it's not just about how we behave as individuals, but how we behave as nations. The judgment that Jesus talks about is the judgment of the nations. And most Christians just do not get that. I think especially in this country. I think we were somewhat warped by slavery, actually. And it created a way of thinking about Christianity that allowed people not to engage on the issue of slavery. So I think it kind of distorted American Christianity. But in fact, the God of the Bible is the lover of our souls and also the Lord of nations. Our God, the real God, is the God of history who shakes nations and shakes nations in order to insist on justice for people who are poor. That is the real God. The lover of our souls and the God of history. So if you start with the Old Testament, the seminal revelation of the Lord to the Hebrew people was the Exodus. And God did not send Moses to the Pharaoh to take up a collection of canned goods. God sent Moses to Pharaoh with a political message that Pharaoh should let those slaves go free. And in that case, it was a radical political message. And then the law of Moses, God revealed himself through the Mosaic law. And the law that Moses gave the people is shot through with special concern about widows and orphans and immigrants. It is just there. And then when the prophets came to Israel and Judah, they really had two messages. Worship the real God and be ethical, especially toward people who are poor and oppressed. And really the way you know whether you're worshiping the real God is that the real God requires us to be ethical. Some of those people who were dancing around on the mountaintops, they were using all the right words. They were singing all the right hymns. They called the Lord, Yahweh. But they were somehow able to go up there and dance and have a tremendously powerful religious experience, but they weren't working for justice. They weren't sharing with the poor. They weren't working for justice in the land. And God said through the prophets, I hate your worship. That is not worshiping me, the real God. And the prophets went especially to the kings, who were the government of the day, and insisted that the kings had a responsibility for justice in the land. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus and all the people who are in the New Testament none of them had any political influence. This was the Roman Empire, you couldn't write a letter to Pontius Pilate, on Pontius Pilate's, trying to influence Pontius Pilate that way. But our Lord Jesus was deeply concerned about the law. And it was helpful for me to realize, just to register, that there was no separation between church and state. So the Sabbath law was the law of the land. That was the law of the land. And other ritual laws, there was a connection between the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities, the national and religious authorities, and Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate, the Romans, supported the local law, and that law was the law of the Sabbath, the law of purity. And our Lord Jesus said, if the law stands in the way of healing people, I won't obey the law. Is this not true? So Jesus put the health of people above the law. And on issues of the purity law, Jesus was insistent that when law marginalized people, when law marginalized women or Samaritans or Gentiles, that was not a law that should be obeyed. And it's because of Jesus' challenge to the laws as they were being implemented that in the end the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate came together to crucify our Lord. And then in the resurrection, Jesus is alive in us, and that same Spirit that embraces everybody, that is free, that is creative, that same Spirit of Jesus is very much alive in this room. The only person in the New Testament, the only Christian in the New Testament, or disciple of Jesus in the New Testament who is a citizen is St. Paul. St. Paul was a Roman citizen. And St. Paul used his citizenship to advance the gospel mission. So surely those of us here who are citizens of the most powerful nation in the earth, probably the most powerful nation in the history of the earth, should be using our citizenship to advance the cause of the gospel, the things that God cares about. And one thing we know that God cares about is the health of everybody, especially people who don't have a chance to have a healthy, good, and even have a chance to live up to their God-given potential. So that's my take on one way to think about the biblical basis for advocacy. It's all the way through the scriptures. And it's in the crucifixion and resurrection. It's in the Exodus. This is not kind of a few proof texts along the way. It's at the core of what we know about our Lord. Now then, there are also practical reasons for advocacy. It's just the case that if you're trying to make a healthy world for everybody, what governments do is really important. And the resources of churches and charities, just in financial terms, tend to be pretty small. And what the government does with its resources are really important. The government also has power to influence people through other policies. So it's just important. And so if we're trying to achieve the kind of world that God surely aches for, we've got to be involved in influencing governments. And the U.S. government is a crucial government in these matters on global health. I think what's happened on AIDS is a very clear, very obvious example that virtually everybody in this country can get. Because people know, almost everybody knows that AIDS was out of control. It was a pandemic. And in fact, a relatively small group of conservative Christians got to President George W. Bush. President Bush provided leadership. A much larger group of lots of Christians, also a lot of other people, helped to get funding for PEPFAR and related initiatives that really tackled the global AIDS problem. And remarkably, we have been able to halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS. That it would not have happened without U.S. government leadership. And so for those of you who back in the, a decade or a little bit more ago, who were involved in that big push to get AIDS was a problem issue because people thought it had to do with sex and maybe homosexuality, and it wasn't easy in the churches. But those of you who helped to push to get the U.S. government to be an ally of people who are vulnerable to HIV and AIDS around the world, we did something really, really good. Really, really good. A more recent example is the leadership on the issue of hunger and malnutrition. In 2008, the prices of the basic grains, rice, wheat, corn, those basic grain prices jumped by about 100%. And so for most of the poor people in the world, they're spending 2/3 of their total income on rice, wheat, or corn. So when the price of the main thing that they purchased jumped, people who were eating 2 meals a day went to 1 meal a day. Those who were eating no meals a day, 1 meal a day, went to some kind of a soup or nothing or roots. So there was this huge surge in world hunger and malnutrition. It happened quickly, and our databases, our data systems aren't that great, so we don't know how many. But maybe 200 million more people were driven into hunger. Unbelievable crisis. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton, to their credit, when they came into office in January 2009, they had a lot of other things to do, you may remember. There was a lot going on, but they focused on this. And so at Obama's first G8 summit, and I don't even know exactly where it came from. I'd like to say Bread for the World clued them in. But they were on it. I mean, in Secretary Clinton, her second day in office, there was a meeting on the world food crisis going on in Madrid, and somebody told her, and she went down to the video room at the State Department and addressed that conference on the global food crisis her second day in the State Department. So at Obama's first G8 summit, he went and proposed that the G8 together commit an additional $33 billion to address this problem of increased hunger. Mainly their idea at that time was let's invest in agriculture in poor countries around the world. And they managed to, the US put in some extra money, but mainly they provided leadership. So they got all the G8 countries and a lot of companies, a lot of NGOs focused on the issue, and most importantly, the poor country governments themselves, Bangladesh, Malawi, Rwanda, they invested more of their government resources in agriculture. In January 2008, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, came out with the summary findings of a series of studies all over the world on how to reduce child malnutrition. If you have limited dollars, what are the highest impact ways to reduce child malnutrition? I remember reading that article and thinking, oh God, this is providential, because I've worked on world hunger for a long time and I've seen all kinds of child hunger schemes. But finally, we had evidence-based findings on if you're trying to reduce the scourge of child malnutrition, what's the priority order? What do you do first? What do you do second? How do you use limited dollars? A number of us Bread for the World, certainly, but not by ourselves. We worked with Save the Children and Interaction and other groups, maybe some of you. And we went to the State Department and talked to Secretary of State's Chief of Staff, and Rod Shaw at that time was at USDA still. And we just shared, look, we have new information about how to best use money to reduce child malnutrition. And Secretary Clinton got engaged in that. It had been called, and still internationally is called, Scaling Up Nutrition. Are all of you familiar with that, the Scaling Up Nutrition priorities? If you just are, can you raise your hand? If you're not, just Google Scaling Up Nutrition. Because, if you're health practitioners, it is just really good information. I mean, the first thing you do is focus available resources on babies and pregnant women. Duh. But now, but in fact, most nutrition programs don't do it. They focus on school children because it's easier. And then secondly, you get information to low-income parents about the power of washing your hands with soap and exclusive breastfeeding. So that's something that churches really can do in a very powerful way. And it has a big impact on the nutrition of those kids. Secretary Clinton really loved it in the end. And so I think the Secretary of State of the United States gave like 4 or 5 speeches on child malnutrition. I mean, think about, can you imagine any prior Secretary of State doing that? And just by jawboning, she was able to mobilize the world. And she got the UK government and the Canadian government excited, and 40 of the high-burden countries, the governments have set up scaling up nutrition programs in the country together with civil society groups. Now, so far, really, the US government hasn't put any money into it at all. So we've just, over the last year and a half, we've been pushing to get some money behind all this rhetoric. But what's striking is that the rhetoric got a lot done in the world, even before we got the money. And then recently, Rod Shaw announced a nutrition strategy for AID. So what they're going to do, turns out the US government's spending $10 billion, or $3.5 billion a year, $10 billion over a 3-year period, on nutrition-related stuff. And just by shifting money from relatively low-impact ways of doing business to these new evidence-based ways, they can have a big impact. And then the other thing we're doing right now is trying to reform US food aid, because basically 50 cents on the dollar of US food aid goes to transportation and administration. And if we could reform food aid, we would help a lot more people and also be able to get more money for the things that would really help to reduce nutrition. So these are examples of how advocacy, public policy advocacy for any government, but especially for the US government, is practically important. So if we feel called to work for the health of the people of the world, we have got to, certainly those of us who are US citizens, have got to be using our expertise, our pens. If you live in a developing country, you can tell your members of Congress back home what it's like, what's really needed, what's really working. That is great power, and it's practically important. Third, let me talk about the gospel and advocacy. And on this, this angle, I'm kind of ashamed because, I'm a preacher. And it's really only a few years ago that I really caught on to the deep connection between our experience of the grace and mercy of God in Jesus Christ and an insistence on public justice. And ironically, what opened my eyes was a book on sociology. There's a book called American Grace, really great book. It's readable, it's thick, but it's really readable. And it's by a Jewish sociologist at Harvard named Robert Putnam, and then David Campbell at Notre Dame. And it's mostly based on lots of surveys, phone surveys, of what Americans believe about God and religion and how they practice God and how they practice their religion. So just asking people, what do you really think? And what they found is that, indeed, if somebody is a member of a religious community, so they go to church regularly, it's really important that they stay after church and socialize with people. If they just walk in the church and pray and don't socialize, it doesn't have the same sociological impact. But if they are part of a worshiping community, in fact, people are more charitable and more civically engaged. But they also found out, somewhat to our chagrin, I guess, that in general, what you believe doesn't have much impact on how you behave. So if you worship on Saturday or Sunday or believe in the world was created in 6 days or not, those things don't have very much impact. They're empirically on how people behave on these issues. But then on like page 283 or something, as kind of an aside, they say, you know, there is one doctrine that really seems to have an impact. And that is that people who experience God as a loving presence in their lives are much more inclined to support foreign aid and food stamps. I was just amazed. I mean, but it's the experience of God's embrace that there's a sociological association between the gospel experience and people then who are moved to really try to change society, to change the rules. Now, you know, I'm not sure. First of all, I wasn't, since this is only like 4 pages in this 500-page book, you know, I wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure I got this right. As sociologists, what they were trying to show is that it's the group experience more than theology that makes the difference. But this, you know, on the core experience of Christianity, that's what really makes a difference on social justice. So Putnam was on some kind of leave. I couldn't get a hold of him, so I managed to find an email address for David Campbell, and I sent him an email on a Sunday afternoon. I was going to give a speech to a group of church leaders, and I said, you know, I want to get this right. Do I understand this correctly? And so he said, yeah, you got it right. Let me just check. And then after going back and forth on email, Putnam showed up on the email train. Turned out he was listening in even though he wasn't answering. So here I had these two guys on email in the afternoon, and they were pulling out their spreadsheets and looking at the data, and they say, yeah, indeed. If people, in fact, some people don't go to church, but if they experience God as a loving presence in their life, they're much more inclined to do the kinds of things Bread for the World wants people to do. And I think this is just my guess, but another characteristic of those of us who experience God as loving is that we tend to trust other people more than most people do. And just from my personal experience, it's because I sin so much, you know, and God just trusts me again and said, okay, you're my ambassador. You know, I just recognize in myself that that God gives me a lot more credit than I deserve. You know, and so if somebody else screws up once in a while, even if it's my wife, you know, I mean, there's a reservoir of forgiveness that comes from being forgiven as much as most all of us are. And then the other thing that I think is maybe the reason for this is that those of us who have experienced the love of God in Jesus Christ, it's not enough to go to church. There are a lot of people in church every Sunday morning who do not experience God as loving. They experience God as remote. They experience God as a judge. So the cross is right there, but that's not what they're experiencing. But those of us who have experienced God's grace and mercy in Jesus Christ know that it is transformative. It has transformed us. It over time changes us. And we know that it's also a power that can change the world. So I think that's another reason why people who experience the gospel are willing to push for big changes for people who are poor. So it's biblical, it's practical, it's gospel grounded, and then it's urgent. Right now, I find it just almost unbelievable that the world as a whole has cut in half the number of people who are in extreme poverty since 1990. The number of children under the age of 5 who die every day has roughly been cut in half since 1990. So that today, 19,000 fewer children died than on a similar day 25 years ago. You know, you all travel in low-income countries, developing countries. So, you know, you see the lives, a lot of lives that have been transformed. I got a chance to go back to Bangladesh a couple years ago. My wife and I lived and worked in northwest Bangladesh more than 35 years ago, and I got a chance to go back to the same village where I lived back and lived and worked back then, and even found some of my old friends. And their lives, I mean, people in Bangladesh are still really poor. But obvious, you know, by dropping back into the same place 35 years later, I could just see, you know, the kids are better nourished, the kids are healthier, the women are more assertive. It's not Sweden, but they're more assertive than they were 35 years ago. Mr. Badi, who's the school teacher, I used to sleep at his home a lot of nights. And it used to be a thatched house. Now it's a concrete block house. And he was quick to point out that the gully next to his house where the mosquitoes used to breed, that gully's been filled in. But this has happened all over the world. Hundreds of millions of people who maybe prayed to God to let their kids go to school have seen their kids go to school. So my friends in Bangladesh all thank God for what God has done in their lives. And surely we who can see that this has happened in hundreds of thousands of communities, it's Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Ghana, Brazil, UK. There are lots of places where the world has been able to improve the quality of life, the healthfulness of life for people at the bottom. And surely we should see this as our loving God moving in our history. I see this as a great exodus that is happening in our time, bigger than the Exodus, a lot bigger than the Exodus from Egypt. And we, all of us, are privileged to be part of that band. In fact, leaders of this great exodus that is happening in our own history. Because it's happening in so many different kinds of countries, we know that further progress, dramatic progress, is possible in our time. And so the world is moving toward, the nations of the world are moving toward a consensus around the 2030 goals. They will probably agree that we will try to end extreme poverty in every nation of the world by 2030. You know, we cut poverty in half between 1990 and 2015. So it's not out of the question. I mean, there'll still be places of violence and drug addiction and things like that. But this kind of mass, normal poverty that we see now, that could be a thing of the past by 2030. You know, the specific goals are still being debated, but they may agree to try to virtually end hunger, to make it possible for everybody in the world to have a healthy life by 2030. Now, you know, the specific goals, in a way, are less important than the broad point that we live at a time when we may be able to be agents of a historic liberation And if this is possible, we know that God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, aches for it, wants us to be part of it, wants us to provide leadership. If Christians around the world are really leaders of this great transformation that God's made possible for our generation, what a powerful witness that will be. But you can't get there with just charitable activity or one-on-one activity. You also need to have leadership commitment, more commitment than we have now, from the governments of the world, and a stronger commitment from the U.S. government is crucial. Crucial. You cannot get to where we could be by 2030 without getting U.S. government leadership, much stronger leadership than we have now. You know, it doesn't have to be, I think it could be one of the top 20 priorities of the U.S. government. U.S. government's never considered global development and health one of its top 20 priorities. In the UK, I think they do. But in this country, no, it's never been. But that's what we've got to change. If it's one of the top 20 priorities of the U.S. government, then I think we're going to get to some kind of really, something like the end of poverty by 2030. Now, we at Bread for the World, we're focusing on 2017 because in 2017, we're going to have a new president, a new Congress. There are open primaries in both major political parties. What that means is there'll be a lot of different voices competing to say this is where the nation ought to go. Usually it only happens once every 8 years. So this election between now and November 2016 is a time in which those of us who live in and vote in this country, we can help to shape the priorities of the United States of America. And if we're going to get to where the nations of the world are likely to say they want to get by 2013, we need to make hunger and poverty a priority for the USA by 2017. It's a big stretch from where we are now. Not impossible, but it is a stretch. I think since this group is really focused on the global issues, I think just practically, it can't just be global. You know, we're not going to have another Bono decade where George Bush could promote some things for Africa and rock stars could sing and everybody thought it was popular. Let's go help Africa. Because there are a lot of Americans. In fact, what the U.S. has done has eliminated that surge in world hunger that took place in 2008, but there was also a 40% increase in hunger in America. And that has not been reversed. And those people, and a lot of people, the sisters and cousins and other people who are really struggling in this country right now, are not going to be supportive of a strong U.S. role on global health issues unless they feel like this is part of a broader effort to make first America a land of opportunity for all Americans, and then, yeah, sure, they'll support American leadership to make the world a world of opportunity for everybody. So there is an urgency about increased engagement in advocacy right now. We need to strengthen institutions of advocacy. We need to win on a series of issues, foreign aid funding, the other issues that you're going to work on your lobby day tomorrow. We need to win on a series of issues because when you win in Congress, especially if you win big, the politicians learn that they shouldn't bucket, that's the way things are going. We also need to be involved in elections. This is a year of elections. And so I think it's a Christian responsibility to be an active citizen in elections and to help somebody who's going to help us on these issues get elected. And then more deeply, I think we need to be, those of us who have this global perspective on what God may be doing in our time, we need to also find ways to be evangelists. Because I don't think we're going to be able to get this country to get serious about hunger and poverty unless a lot of people have a fresh and holistic experience of Jesus. that leads them to insist that our country get serious about hunger, poverty, and disease in our own country and all over the world. So it's not just about going to lobby Congress. It's also about deepening our prayer life, relaxing more deeply into the grace of God and Jesus Christ, and then sharing the gospel and praying that God will do what we can't do to bring us to a world where everybody has a chance to be healthy. I'll quit there. Are there some questions? Yeah, sure. Let's clap.
Raise your hands if you've got questions. I'll start here and work my way around. Let me bring you the microphone.
I mean, you read about Wilberforce. I mean, the man took the issue and he drove it. And I can't understand why the church can't get focused on that issue and why we are so divided on that particular one. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, immigration, the two main issues that Bread for the World, the two leading issues that we're focused on this year, or right now especially, are food aid reform, because it's an issue on which we've won a few victories lately, and it's not Republican or Democrat on the votes. It's half and half, so they're close votes, but it's not a polarizing issue. I mean, you'd think that saying, hey, this is a way we could save the taxpayers' money and reach millions more of the world's poorest people. You'd think that would be sort of an easy one, but it's not, because the interests that benefit from the way things are organized now fight back. But then the other issue we're working on is immigration reform, because we think there's still a chance that Congress will act on that this year. It's not without prayer and fasting. You know, the Representative Cantor's defeat will scare more of the House Republicans who might have voted for it. They'll be afraid of Tea Party challenges. But but the leadership, Speaker Boehner, Representative McCarthy, the leadership gets that this is good it's also good for the Republican Party. If they don't move on this issue, they will not win the White House. So just politically, they're ready to move. So I think you're right that it's all from the point of view of people, Christian people, you know, these folks, all these people who are here and are don't have status, they're abused, by giving them legal status, it would allow them to work their way out of poverty. It's not a question of, they're not asking for money. They could get better jobs, they could go to school. Also, you know, in an internationally oriented crowd, all those folks down in Guatemala and Honduras, a lot of those people, you know, they want jobs. And our farms and orchards can't find people. The immigration groups and the growers agree on that some sort of a guest worker program would be good for the Guatemalans and Hondurans, and also good for the U.S. economy and the agricultural economy. So it makes all kinds of sense. So Bread for the World, this is an issue that affects hungry and poor people. And it's an issue on which we could do a lot this year. So I agree with you that it takes us a little bit afield of the issues that this conference is focused on, but maybe that's good in the sense that I think for us to win, we've got to get our nation to care more about people in need. We're good at a lot of things. We're really good at individual rights. We're good at freedom of expression. We are not as good at caring about people in need. So it's that broader push that then will also pay off in really strong leadership on global health. We have tremendous opportunity with not much money, nickels by the standards of Congress. We could play a transformative role in the world on global health issues. With a little bit of money, we can do a lot. But it seems to me that broader if we could get that broader movement in the American spirit and in American politics, then support for global health would be like froth on the wave.
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm a nurse. So in that vein of getting people to care for those in need, when speaking to elected officials, obviously our biblical basis for justice probably isn't going to carry a lot of weight with secular organizations. So what arguments do you find to be most effective, be they economic, social, when speaking to government officials to get them to care about these issues?
I use God. I talk about God. I talk about the Bible. I mean, it depends a little bit on who you're talking to. So sometimes, mostly, high-level political officials, including our members of Congress, I find these very decent people. They're under a lot of pressure, and so sometimes they do bad things. But they're decent people. And if you appeal to them just on the basis of humanitarian concerns, also the global health issues are, because in an era when diseases move around the world, global health issues are an issue. These are issues of national security. If people are healthy around the world, we'll have a more prosperous world, and it'll be good for our economy, good for the kind of economy your children grow up in. It'll be better if Africa is really hitting on all cylinders. So there are those arguments. But then, in the end, I sort of say, I think this is what God wants us to do. And I find that the most powerful argument. We can make that argument, and you have to be a little careful, but if you're respectful of the differences of just who you're talking to, if you talk, or even if you talk out of your heart and say, look, I'm a Christian. I feel that God loves me and you and also kids in Africa who don't get enough to eat. That's a very powerful argument, no matter who you're talking to.
David, thank you very much for being here. Adrienne Allison from World Vision.
Yeah.
We appreciate your work and your advocacy on the Hill so much. And because you're you're used to working with politicians, I have an ask, which is that in the area of cutting down undernutrition and malnutrition, family planning has an essential role to play. And so we know that if all births were spaced by 3 years, malnutrition would be cut in half, according to Shea Rutstein. So it's a critical tool for us to use to address malnutrition.
Yep.
So I appreciate you supporting it somehow. But the other issue is population growth, because we're at 7 billion now, but we're going to be at 10 billion, and the question of nutrition is, and within the context of climate change, is going to become more difficult unless we slow somehow that growth rate. So your support for that would be totally wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. We're somewhat constrained because we've inherited this very broad support from within all stripes of the Christian churches. And there are a couple of issues on which the churches are deeply divided. I have a gay son, but gay rights that's a hard issue for a lot of people. Having a gay son, it's kind of brought me around. And then also, certainly abortion and contraception are really difficult issues. So I don't think there are any of the churches who are not concerned about rapid population growth in Kenya. My sense is the Catholic bishops in Kenya are also concerned about family planning. They encourage family planning in Kenya. I think the Catholic Church over the years has been really strong, at least in conferences on the most powerful contraceptive is education for girls and land rights for women. So at least in terms of their diplomacy, the Vatican has made that point that trying to do right by women, liberation of women, is an important way that we can bring down population growth rates without contraception, where they really what they're really alarmed about is if it edges over into abortion. But it makes it difficult for Bread for the World to work on the U.S. population accounts because, they don't completely hedge off any contact with institutions that are involved in abortion. So it's a tricky one. I really appreciate that CCIH has taken it on, and I think you're playing an important role.
Okay.
And I like the way you talk about it. Your stress on that it should be not imposing contraception on anybody, that it should be respectful of the religious and respectful of, this is an intimate matter. So it should be, we should do this in a way that's respectful of consciences. And just from what I read, I think CCIH is really providing important leadership. So thanks.
David, I appreciate your words. You just alluded to where I'm trying to go with the comment you just made about the division that exists within the Christian church. I have had a recent and rather vitriolic online debate with a fellow Christian over the issue that he perceives, as many within the Christian church do, that federal support for the sort of work that is done by the people in this room, federal support for feeding people, for health, for things like that, is, and I quote, charity at the point of a gun. Unless we take on the advocacy not only to our members of Congress, but to the perhaps half of the United States that believes in this way and calls themselves followers of Jesus, we're barking up the wrong tree. Could you share a little about that form of advocacy with us, please?
That is absolutely true, and I think it's really important. Some of you are in missionary situations, and you have a base of people in this country who support global Christian mission, and so, when you talk to congregations, when you talk to Christian people in this country about how can we express God's love for all people, then part of that is getting our government to demonstrate some concern. My sense is that a lot of Africans, for example, have a sense that the world's basically divided between white people and non-white people, and the white people a lot of them are sort of kind of Christian, and they basically don't give a damn about the non-white people. So in that context, missionaries in countries, they've got a credibility problem because people are not, that is, people in the low-income countries are not naive about the fact that this missionary represents one strand of American life, but they have somehow failed to deliver the nation. So I think you're right that, even as some of you are missionary networks, so part of your communication could be, this is self-serving, but whether it's Bread for the World or something else, if you don't want to get involved in the advocacy yourself, you can encourage your supporters to become part of Bread for the World's network as another way that they share the gospel of Jesus Christ with the whole world. And then, if you have relationships with congregations, and my guess is there are quite a few people who support Christian networks who would share that view that I'll support a missionary, but I'm not going to vote for a guy who's going to support foreign aid. So if you can help those people to see that working for effective assistance, not all foreign aid, but effective assistance, there are ways that they can help make it more effective, that they can provide help to get money for the best programs that maybe your agency is using. So, just getting that, taking a little step to see that how we behave as a nation is also part of our global witness. That's a really great point. Advocacy with the churches may be more important than your own, although, your own voice with your members of Congress is also powerful, especially if you're working or your people are working in around the world. Somebody who writes a letter from Senegal to explain what they see, and that, but they remember who is their senator, who is their member of Congress. That is a very powerful letter because you speak with credibility and you speak with, tell them what you know and why you know it. Or if you have a chance to tomorrow or on other days to go see them and make a relationship with a staffer in that office, maybe a Christian person who, you know, could staff them on agriculture. And so on food aid reform, you'd help us out.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question that Mona's going to allow. I want to go back to the nation level that you talked about. When I was at USAID, you know, representing the U.S. government, you walk into an international meeting, you are often hated just because you are the U.S. government. But I was astounded, and it was on PEPFAR more than anything else and on AIDS, that even when we weren't liked, they followed our model and started doing things globally on AIDS. You gave the example of the same kind of thing with Secretary Clinton about being a voice, even without money in that case, and having the world follow suit. Those are lovely long-term wins. How does a room full of people like this that you want to get in, and they want to get involved in advocacy, measure the success of advocacy in less than 15-year blocks so that we can know we're making a difference and beginning to move the ball?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, things take time. And if you're trying to make big changes, 15-year blocks are about the right period to see whether it's really making a difference or not. But for example, on over the last, in spring 2011, the House of Representatives launched a really major, very insistent effort to cut U.S. government spending. And of their proposed cuts, 2/3 would come from programs that go only to poor people, including big cuts in all the international assistance programs that we care about. And the House of Representatives as a whole has pushed in an uncompromising way, you know, almost shut down the government a few times to get those cuts enacted. And initially, the Democrats were not talking about what's this going to do to poor people. You know, a group of church leaders had a meeting with President Obama, and the Catholic bishop said, you know, in my Bible it says, whatsoever, he said, it doesn't say whatsoever you do for the struggling middle class, you do it unto me. Because the Democrats were all about the middle class. We had a meeting with Chairman Ryan early in that debate. And he just went off, he started talking about why they wanted to cut Social Security and Medicare. And, you know, I finally had to say, you know, we're not here to talk about Social Security and Medicare. We're here to talk about SNAP and Medicaid and international development assistance. He just didn't even know. So the faith community was really, especially in those early days, we were the only, especially the Christian community, we were the strongest voice that was saying, hey, these cuts are going to kill people, especially the international cuts kill. And it wasn't just a group in Washington. You know, we mobilized hundreds of thousands of people and thousands of local congregations to write letters to their own members of Congress about this issue. And so that debate, I think, sort of kind of ended with the budget deal that was passed at the beginning of this year, the Murray-Ryan budget deal. They were able to agree on a budget without threatening, you know, this massive, you know, a shutdown of the government. They were able to agree on a budget. So it's sort of kind of over. And the cuts in programs that go only to poor people have been about 2% of what the House Republicans wanted. The President and Congress have cut $4 trillion from deficits, but the cuts to poor people's programs have been relatively small. And for the last 3 years, those foreign assistance programs that are relevant to poor people, so the global health accounts, also the global development accounts, IDA, Gavi, all those accounts, for the last 3 years, on a bipartisan basis, Congress has increased funding for the things that are important to poor people around the world. Who knew? In the midst of this big budget debate. So that's not a 15-year fight. But it has been a 4-year fight. But we have won big. And as a result, if any of you get any money from any official source, probably the money hasn't been cut. And so a lot of good things continue that we're really on the chopping block. Let me just say one more. I want to tell you a story before I quit, just because. And that is, I mean, a lot of you travel or live in developing countries, so you see these things all the time. But a few years ago, I got to go to northwest Mozambique. Are anybody here from Mozambique? Okay. So I went to a place way up on Lake Nyanza. Our first stop was this little place called Ntimbe, which is a settlement of 40 mud houses. And we came in on a kind of a ramshackle old wooden boat. And, people, they're probably 100 miles from the nearest road. And, there is no concrete in Ntimbe. It's just mud. You can imagine this place. And the folks there were probably 50 people on the shore. And so our boat was coming in. I was with an American woman who used to work at Bread for the World, who now works for the Anglican Diocese of Northern Mozambique. So she's been helping churches organize AIDS programs, AIDS awareness programs. And then they branched out into agriculture. So as we came in, the folks on the shore started singing praise songs. And so in this group, you can kind of imagine that. These people were singing. And the Mozambican people on the boat, they started singing the same songs. So we were, and one guy got up on the sides of the boat. I was thinking, oh my God, and he was singing and clapping these songs, and we arrived with great celebration. These people were so hospitable. They took all of our possessions. I sometimes carry a big black briefcase that I learned to carry when I used to work at the World Bank. And there was this lady, she had this black briefcase on her head. She was dancing up the hill singing a praise song with this big old black briefcase on her head. And we got to the top of the hill. They have constructed a beautiful mud brick church. Really fancy, in fact. And so we met first meeting was in a little clearing there outside the mud brick church. And Rebecca asked them through translators, tell my friend from America how things have improved here in Ntimbe. It wasn't clear to me that and in fact there was a pause, a kind of an awkward pause. And then somebody said, well, we have peace. Because through that long civil war, there were terrible atrocities in this little place. And they had to flee everybody ran to Malawi. One time they all ran to Tanzania for a couple years or whatever. So we have peace. And Mozambique has a pretty good government by my standards. And then somebody said, well, we have a school now. And they indeed they now have a school. Before, say, I don't know when, 2003 or something, there were no school in the community. But now all the kids, even the AIDS orphans, get to go to school. So all these kids are learning to read and write and add and subtract. And then somebody said, well, and also there's AIDS medication. Because when AIDS first came to Ntimbe, people had no idea what it was, so there were accusations of witchcraft and who was doing this terrible, evil thing to us. And so the parents were saying, the elder generation was saying, it's because of the wickedness of you young people. And husbands were saying to their wives, it's because of your witchcraft that I have this terrible thing. And now people understand what AIDS is, and we met 4 women in Ntimbe who get antiretrovirals paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. And they are now part of the AIDS awareness team of the local Anglican church, and they go talk to the kids in the school and share. And they're taking care of their kids. They're farming and taking care of their kids. So it was a very vivid picture for me of what God is doing in the world to bring health and well-being to all of God's people. And then what really sent chills up my spine was that Mozambique got schools for many more of their children because of international debt relief, the Jubilee campaign, which was a Christian-driven campaign all over the world. We got a reduction in the debts of Mozambique, which allowed them to eliminate school fees and to provide schools in places like Ntimbe. So here I'm on the other side of the world and way away from any transportation, and I can see that advocacy by Christians in the U.S. made a difference in the school. And in those women who go, they take a sailboat across the lake to a clinic on the other side of the lake, and they get antiretrovirals. So they are living and thriving, and the whole community understands what AIDS is. And that wouldn't have been possible without the advocacy of American Christians. So I think some people don't get involved in advocacy because it seems political and abstract and hard. It takes 15 years to get anything done. That's true. But these are real human beings who have been powerfully helped by the advocacy of Christians in this country. Thanks a lot for all you do.